Can you hear me? Is this on? Got the thumbs up, so I guess we can start now. Appreciate everybody being here tonight. Tonight our topic is going to be the fossil record. So I'm a scientist or a geologist. I'm not. So I welcome any input any of you have and you want to give on this topic. I'm going to kind of go through it the way it makes sense to me. So hopefully it does the same to you all as well. But as I said, we're going to talk about the fossil record tonight. And the question being, does the fossil record conflict with biblical creation? So that's our main premise is, do the fossils that are being found, does that in some way conflict with creation? So we talk about what is a fossil. And it's the hardened remains or parts of plants and animals that are found in the Earth's crust. Some fossils, they turn to stone as minerals fill the hollows of bones or wood. You have some fossils that are footprints that were left in the mud that later turned to stone. You have others where mud covers an organism, and then as that plant or animal decays, it leaves a hollowed out space in the rock. And then you also have some where it becomes encased in tree sap, which turns to amber. If any of you have ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, that's kind of the premise of that this dinosaur DNA got encased in amber and they were able to reproduce. But that's kind of the premise of that. But before we start the discussion about it, because this is important to our discussion, I'm going to read from Genesis starting in chapter 7 and verse 17. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. So that's probably a minimum of 22 feet to 25 feet, something like that, above the mountains. That's how much water we're talking about. And the waters prevailed, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So we have 40 days of rain, then 150 days of the water prevailing on the earth at that height above the mountains. And then you pick up in chapter 8, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the water had abated. So you're talking all told here, to the time the waters abated, about 340 days. So if I'm looking at that right, you had water covering most of the earth for close to a year. So that's going to be relevant to our discussion tonight. So I think if you're here tonight, you're going to answer this question an obvious no. Did we evolve from a single organism? We talked about that some yesterday. You know, evolutionists would want us to believe that life formed as single cells in shallow oceans and then somehow evolved into more complex and complex plants and animals. If this is the case, if man, plants, all kinds of animals continue to evolve, then that should be abundant in the fossil record, right? That's what we should see. Who in here has ever been to the Grand Canyon? You know, what do geologists say about the age of that? How many millions of years does that rock you see represent? You know, you have all these different layers and colors that they say represents different eras in time. And the same thing happens if you dig down in any level. You see these different supposed geologic eras. Geologists say that the rock goes down 100 to 200 miles deep. But even at the Grand Canyon and other exposed areas similar, at most you're seeing about a mile worth of that 100 to 200 miles of rock. So if you think about it, if evolution occurred, then as we go down those different layers, you would be seeing different type animals. And down at the bottom layers, you would see those beginning organisms that evolutionists talk about. And then you work your way up, and you would see more evolved species. That would make sense if evolution occurs, right? One of the things I failed to say after I read the account of the flood, that almost all fossils that are found are in sedimentary rock. And does anybody remember from their science days what sedimentary rock is made from? It's rock that water has flowed through and made. I can't explain it any better than that, but I know that water is involved with making it. So let's look at it from a different perspective. If you have evolution, you would see all these fossils in all these different layers, you would presume. But if a flood occurred, and remember the waters were on the earth for a year, we would expect to find very few fossils below a certain layer. And that flood, on the other hand, and that flood layer ought to be a worldwide graveyard in that same level if a flood occurred. So think about that as we talk here. You would see all kinds of fossils mixed together. You'd have simple fossils, you'd have complex animals, you would have all that combined. But if evolution occurs, again, you would have survival of the fittest. That's what we've always been taught. So you would see, as you go up, again, more complex organisms. So that's basically the two things you would want to see. So the interesting thing is that fossils appear abruptly. You don't have fossils in those lower levels. Has anybody ever heard of the Cambrian explosion? This refers to the many fully formed creatures, fully formed, that abruptly appear in the fossil record at a certain layer. Now, geologists will tell you that rock layer is between 540 million to 600 million years old. Johnny dealt well last night with the age of the earth, and I don't need to get into that. But that's the layer they say that is. But that is where the fossils first start, and I hope I'm making sense here. But again, they're in an advanced state. These fossils are in an advanced state. They're these minor organisms and all. And it's as if they were just planted there. Again, there's nothing building up, and then all of a sudden you have this layer that's full of fossils. So this rapid diversification puzzled Darwin, and I'm going to have some quotes here from some evolutionists. And it remains one of the biggest questions for the people that are proponents of evolution today. Very few fossils exist of organisms that could be ancestors of bilateral animals prior to this time. And even those that they claim are highly controversial, and you can poke holes in them. The American Scientist magazine acknowledged, as Darwin noted in his Origin of Species, the abrupt emergence of arthropods in the fossil record during the Cambrian period presents a problem for evolutionary biology. There is no obvious, simpler, or intermediate forms, either living or in the fossil record, that show convincingly how modern arthropods evolved from worm-like ancestors. Consequently, there has been a wealth of speculation and contention. Now, Darwin didn't doubt that his theory was correct. He just argued that the right fossils haven't been found yet. That's his argument and several evolutionists. Well, Darwin's been dead for more than 100 years, and those fossils still have not been found to support his theory. Evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Gould admitted that the Cambrian explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life. And the late famous paleontologist who taught at Columbia and Harvard and was at the American Museum of Natural History named George Simpson admitted, most new species, genre, and families in nearly all categories above the level of families appear in the records suddenly and are not led up to by known, gradual, and completely transitional sequences. And this abrupt appearance isn't the only problem. Most of the species that are found in this layer where they just appear are complex. There's a creature called a trilobite that's at the base of the fossil record. And it had a vision system that is more complex than our modern eye. Yet there's no evidence of evolution to get to that point. Complexity at the start of that fossil record conflicts with evolutionary prediction. But again, it would coincide with flood and creation. Again, evolutionists will still argue that the fossil record is incomplete and that when more are found, the gaps will be filled in. However, although fossils are found in different layers, they almost suddenly just appear. There's no step-by-step progression up the geologic column. And also the creatures that that appear in different layers show little to no change. So again, if we're talking the Earth being millions of years old and we evolved a certain way, you would be seeing the fossils and the layers becoming more and more complex. That just doesn't exist. So, you would also expect diversity to precede that. You would have varieties of a single body type in the base of the fossil record, and as you moved up, you would expect to see different body types. I think we would agree the biblical record would be different, right? God initially created different kinds of species from which came variety and diversity within those species. I think Johnny said the term, is it microevolution? I don't think we can deny that within species there is a certain level of evolution. Like I told Johnny earlier, during the Civil War, the height of the average soldier was 5'6". I think today the average man's 5'10" or 11. So that would be microevolution. But you know, there's no ape becoming a man, that type thing. And there's nothing in the record that would even come close to indicating something like that. Biologists have pinpointed a few dozen distinct, and it's called phyla, P-H-Y-L-A, which is the level of organisms, and they base it based on their body plans and their parts. There are 27 different ones that are represented in the fossil record, and 20 of them appear in the Cambrian explosion with no evidence of having evolved. They're already complex, similar to what you would see today, that just suddenly appear. So variety does not even show up to higher up in the fossil record. And again, that would be as creation would predict. It's very problematic for evolutionists, but it would not be from a flood perspective. If you had several, if you had all these creatures die in the flood, you would expect them to all of a sudden appear in a certain layer of the geology. And that's what you have. There's also a term called stasis, and that refers to the observation that after creatures do appear, they remain virtually unchanged through the different layers. So from that first layer where you have so much appear all at once, then even where you have fossils in above layers, there's little or no change from that initial layer. Again, evolution would predict changes as you went up those layers over millions of years. Transitional fossils that would link one species to another species simply do not exist. You always hear about them finding some new skull or something that they want to claim is the missing link, but it always proves to be inconclusive at best, but usually it can be. I think, I don't know if anybody ever remembers Lucy that was found. You may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was eventually decided that that was not a skull from a human. It was from some sort of monkey, but it was not human in nature, and that tends to happen. Stephen Gould, who was evolutionist we mentioned earlier, he admitted that there's no direct evidence of these smooth transitions. He acknowledged that all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms and transitions between major groups, and that they're characteristically abrupt. And he further acknowledged that the inability to construct functional intermediaries has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. Who's seen the evolutionary tree in a textbook or whatever? How things evolved, and then you have these different things at the end of the trees. Well, the problem is that the fossil record only shows the things you have at the tips. There's nothing been found to support that supposed evolutionary chain that gets you to the things on the edge of the tree. Evolutionary biologist James Valentine and Douglas Irvin wrote that if we ever were to expect to find ancestors to our intermediates in the higher taxonomies, it would be in the rocks of the late Precambrian to Ordovicial times when the bulk of the world's higher animal tax evolved. So that's the time period. They divide all these supposed millions of years into different time frames. And this is the time when they would expect, or they say, things evolved. That's their words, not mine. Yet traditional alliances are unknown or unconfirmed for any of the classes appearing in them. And that's the evolutionist quote. Evolutionist zoologist at Oxford University, Mark Ridley, goes as far as to say that no real evolutionists, whether gradualistic or punctuationalists, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. And Charles Darwin asked, why does not every geological formation and every strata full of these intermediate links? He asked that question. He expects them to be there, but they're not. Geology does not reveal any chain, as I've said before. And what's notable is the fact that when paleontologists do uncover a fossil that they hope to be some sort of transitional form, not only is it always controversial, but it's from a vertebrate organism. But vertebrate organisms comprise less than 0.1% of the fossil record. Well over 99% of the fossil record is made up of invertebrate fossils. But you would think even with that, if you have such an amount of plants and invertebrate animals, if we evolve from those such organisms, again, we would see those progressions in the fossil record. But again, that doesn't exist. It's already at a complex layer when it's found. So, what about extinction? As we've been taught, survival of the fittest, things evolve. You would expect, extinction of a lot of animals, of the majority of animals. That would be expected from an evolutionary standpoint. But what about mass extinctions? Mass extinctions would not be predicted because that would be some kind of worldwide catastrophic event. But a mass extinctions would support a catastrophic flood and not gradual evolution. Now again, these are obviously not my numbers or beliefs, but evolutionists say that there's been 5 mass extinction events. They say one was 445 million years ago, at which time 60 to 70% of the species went extinct. I don't know how they project that or where they come up with that, but they do. Then they say between 360 and 70 million years ago, up to another 75% disappeared. Then they say 252 million years ago, 95% of species went extinct. Then 200 million years ago, 70 to 80% went extinct. And then finally, 65 million years ago, another 75% went extinct. 65 million years ago is that number they give for when the dinosaurs went extinct. So that's their predictions. And the causes of these extinctions are unknown. There's speculation of meteors, ice age, some kind of combination, volcanic eruption that was so big it darkened the, that's all their speculation. And I'm not going to get into the issues with radiometric dating. Johnny dealt with that well last night. But those things would be drastically altered, even trying to predict that, under massive water pressure. Again, I think we know what water pressure can do to things. And as we discussed earlier, the Earth was underwater for a year, basically. So think of all the pressure and all that would do. So if you look at the age of the Earth from the biblical account, and we'll say about 10,000, no more than 10,000 years, as Johnny used last night, if you look at the geological levels and columns, then all of these, from the time frame, I hope I'm going to make sense with this, from the time frame that evolutionists use, all these millions of years, and the time frame of these 5 mass extinctions events, they would all fit into one time frame from the biblical record in the 10,000 years. If you kind of factor in those levels that fossils have been made. So if all 5 of those fit into one time period in a biblical record, what would that be about? The flood, right? That explains why everything is found all of a sudden in that level. So, and the way fossils are in those columns would provide an account of the progression. So all those supposed mass extinctions would fall in that flood's time scale. And regardless of the explanation of evidence, extinction and not evolution is found in the fossil record. A mass event of death is in the fossil record, but there's nothing that appears that ties to evolution. Another problem for geologists, and Johnny touched on this last night, is that in some locations, the supposed older rocks are on top of the supposed newer rocks. So how would that occur from just rock building up over years and years and years of time? What could happen to make newer rock, supposed newer rock, be on top of older rock? The flood, obviously, that we talked about. And an example, there's a great slab of sedimentary rock near Agate Springs, Nebraska. And this slab, and by slab I mean one section of rock, holds the bones of 9,000 different animals. You have rhinoceroses, you have modern camels, you have other modern animals, but then you have they're strange animals that nobody knows what they are, but they're all jumbled together in this one section of rock. How would that happen from an evolutionary standpoint? If they were all tossed about together by something quickly and buried before their bodies could decay or be eaten. Again, that cannot be explained by evolution. So then the question becomes, what about the dinosaurs? Again, Johnny dealt a little on this last night. Does anybody know when the first dinosaur fossil was found? I was mistaken. It's older than I thought. I knew when the term came about. But the first one was found in 1677. But at that time, they had no idea what it was. And they thought it was just a bone from a very large human. Another find was made in 1815, and a scientist concluded that it must be from some sort of extinct carnivorous lizard. In 1822, Mary Ann Mantell discovered fossilized bone while on a walk in Sussex, England. So in 1842, this family of fossils was named Dinosauria, which meant terrible lizard. And that's when the term came into existence. So the term dinosaur did not exist before 1842. And again, it was the 1800s before they found these bones and had any idea of what they were dealing with. Now, I'm just going to say this, and if you disagree with me, you can say that, but I've heard people say, they don't know how to explain dinosaurs, because we've always been taught dinosaurs and man didn't exist together. So I've heard people say before, well, God just put those bones in the ground. That to me makes no sense. And the main reason is in 1 Corinthians 14:33, we're told God is not the author of confusion. Why would he put something in the ground to cause all this confusion if that was the case? So I can't help but believe that yes, dinosaurs existed on this earth, and from a creation standpoint, would have had to exist with man, right? So, is there anything, and I'm not talking about Job, is there anything from supposed mythology whose description would resemble that of a dinosaur? I'm talking about ancient writings. Again, the term dinosaur didn't exist until 1842, and people didn't know about the bones.
I think it's about the dragons of mythology.
That's the one dragon. Dragons are in, from what I could gather, basically any old ancient writings. The term dragon itself may not be used, but the descriptions and all used is dragon. The Latin word for dragon, it actually refers to a large serpent or reptile. Very similar to what we would think of a dinosaur. You have Beowulf in some Greek writings. You have ancient Chinese writings referring to dragons. But something I had not heard till studying this, I don't know how I missed this, but Marco Polo in the 1200s writes of while traveling in Asia seeing large two-legged reptiles. And there are no two-legged reptiles still in existence today. And if you think about it, almost all these writings refers to men being able to kill them. Not that it was easy to do, but that men did find a way to kill them, right? Now, we're not going to have time to look. I don't know about the breathing fire, that part. Not all dragons could do that. But I encourage you to read Job chapter 41 is all about the Leviathan. And it talks about, well, I'm going to just give you a couple of things. I encourage you to read it. And then chapter 40 talks about the behemoth, which if you read that, I encourage you to do that later. Sounds just like our description of a dinosaur. But in the description of the Leviathan in Job 41, all right, I don't have the exact part. Okay, verse 18. His sneezings flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils come forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. That is in the biblical record of Job. Yeah.
4 classes over where I grew up, there was a creek that ran in front of our house, and there was a big bluff on each side. One of them was solid rock, probably 30 or 40 feet. And on top of this exposed rock, I could see fossils. They were distinct bones, and one of them was the shape of a skull. You could see the eyes, nose, and this was 75 years ago. And I'm probably the only one that knows about it. I need to tell somebody that.
Yeah, obviously. Harold says where he grew up.
I went back a few years ago, and it's kind of covered with dirt now. It's not just solid rock. It's probably a couple of inches of dirt. That may be protecting it, where it don't
I bet you can find a paleontologist interested in that. But real quick, there is physical evidence that appears to demonstrate the coexistence of man and dinosaurs. I don't know if you've ever seen photos of the temple in Cambodia called Angkor Wat, but there are all kinds of carvings of different animals and stuff on this, and it was built several hundred to 1,000 years ago, again, well before dinosaur fossils being found. And one of those is clearly a Stegosaurus. Where did they do that several hundred years ago if no one had ever seen a dinosaur? In the Carlisle Cathedral in Carlisle, England, there's a tomb for a bishop that died in 1495. And engraved in brass on the tomb is the pictures of two creatures that correspond to our pictures of dinosaurs. Again, dating back to 1495. At Natural Bridges National Monument in Utah, there's a petroglyph under one of the bridges that is clearly an Apatosaurus. And again, that drawing is by Indians several hundred years old. We actually visited there as a family in 2017, and I was unaware of this. We hiked to the bottom of one of them. I wish I'd have known it to look at the time. But what's interesting is in the 1960s, there were actually Apatosaurus bones found in Blanding, Utah, which is about 45 minutes from there. You have the same thing in Havasu Canyon in Arizona, a long-necked dinosaur. Fossils were found about 100 miles from there of a dinosaur that would match the drawings on that again were several years old. So I'll just say, got a couple other things, but somebody will say, well, why does the Bible not mention dinosaurs? There was no such word in Hebrew or Greek, because again, the word didn't exist until 1842. But we do have the behemoth and the Leviathan in Job 40, 41, and 41, so I would encourage you to look at that. Thank you.